One of them was buried alive and heard scratching the tomb walls. One was butchered by the peasant he made emperor. One turned to marble, or so the legend says. For 1,500 years, the most powerful man on earth had the world's most dangerous job. These are the 10 strangest deaths in Byzantine history, and the last one will make your skin crawl. The Byzantine Empire ruled for 15 centuries on wealth, divine right, and betrayal so constant it became government policy. Its emperors were called God's representatives on earth. Sons murdered fathers for the crown, wives poisoned husbands in their sleep, and the throne itself seemed cursed because almost none of these god kings got to choose how they left it. Constantine the Great built a city that carried his name for 1,000 years. He legalized Christianity across the Roman world and presided over the council that shaped the entire Christian faith. He was, by every measure, the most consequential ruler since Augustus. But for 31 years, the man who saved the church refused to actually join it. Constantine had blood on his hands, plenty of it, including his own son and his own wife, executed to keep his throne secure. He knew exactly what that meant for his soul. So he waited. He held off the one ritual that could wipe his ledger clean, gambling that he'd know the right moment to cash it in. In 337 AD, illness finally forced his hand. He traveled to Nicomedia for treatment, and there, on his deathbed, Constantine was finally baptized. He died on May 22nd, wearing white baptismal robes, not the purple of an emperor, but the white of a man erasing every sin he'd ever committed, timed to the very last possible hour. The most powerful man in the world died dressed as a beginner. Theodosius I was the last man to rule a truly united Roman Empire. He made Christianity the state religion. He silenced a 12th century tradition by abolishing the Olympic Games. He survived a brutal military career that killed better men than him. But in the winter of 395 AD, something got him that no enemy soldier ever could. His own body turned on him. Severe edema, fluid retention, likely triggered by his heart or liver giving out, left the man who unified the Roman world bedridden and swollen at just 50 years old. No blade, no poison, no assassin's hand. Just biology, quietly finishing what 1,000 enemies couldn't. Justinian I dreamed of putting the whole Roman Empire back together, and very nearly did it. He built the Hagia Sophia, the largest cathedral on earth for almost 1,000 years. He rewrote the laws that still shape Europe today. With his general Belisarius, he reconquered Africa, Italy, and Spain. If you want the real death behind every name history made famous, subscribe. New one every 2 days. By 565 AD, Justinian had outlived nearly everyone around him, his friends, his enemies, even his legendary general. He was 83, the longest reigning emperor Byzantium ever had, watching the empire he'd bled dry to build finally start to crack under its own weight. And then, on November 14th, the man who spent 5 decades at war with fate got the one ending almost no Byzantine ruler ever received. Justinian died peacefully in his sleep, of natural causes, surrounded by his court, inside the palace he had spent his whole life rebuilding. After all that bloodshed, he simply didn't wake up. Heraclius pulled off a miracle. He took an empire on the verge of total collapse and, over 6 brutal years, crushed the Persians and recovered the true cross for Jerusalem. He was a hero on 3 continents. And then, a new power nobody saw coming erupted out of the desert. The Arab Caliphate tore through everything Heraclius had spent a decade winning back in a fraction of the time. By 641 AD, the man who'd once commanded armies across the heart of Persia was trapped in his own bedroom, watching his life's work evaporate. His body had started failing before his empire did. Heraclius died in what can only be called physical humiliation, his body grotesquely swollen with severe edema, unable to leave his bed, unable even to control his own bodily functions. The general who conquered Persia couldn't conquer his own dying flesh. Basil II was cold, calculating steel wrapped in imperial purple. He spent decades crushing the military aristocracy and pushed the empire to its largest size in centuries. At the Battle of Claudion, he blinded 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners, sparing one eye in every 100 men, just enough to lead the rest home. He never married. He lived in military camps instead of palaces. He hoarded 200,000 pounds of gold and trusted almost no one.
In 1025, at 67 years old, Basil was already planning his next campaign, a full reconquest of Sicily. That campaign never happened. The man who had survived 50 straight years of war died of nothing more dramatic than natural causes, right there in Constantinople. His fortune, built over a lifetime of ruthless discipline, went to a brother who burned through all of it in 3 years flat.
Nikephoros II hated the palace and everything it stood for. They called him the Pale Death of the Saracens. He wore a hair shirt under his royal robes and slept on the bare floor like a soldier, not an emperor, even after he'd already won. While Nikephoros racked up victories in the east, he was losing a different war entirely, the one inside his own palace. He alienated the church, he taxed the nobles into open hatred, and he never noticed, or never let himself notice, that his wife was sleeping with his best general. On a cold December night in 969, Theophano left the bedchamber door unlocked. Nikephoros was asleep on the floor the way he always slept when the men his wife loved most came in through the dark. The assassins knocked his teeth out with the hilts of their swords before they finished the job. His skull was split open and his body was left exposed under the open sky. A soldier emperor, killed the way he'd killed so many others, in the dark by people he trusted. Michael III is remembered mostly for his excesses, drinking himself sick, obsessing over horse races, staging mocking parodies of church services for laughs. He found a peasant named Basil, liked his strength, and promoted him all the way to co-emperor. Michael thought he'd found a loyal servant, someone to handle the boring business of ruling while he kept drinking. He never once suspected the man he'd pulled out of nothing. In September 867, after another long night of wine, Michael stumbled to his chambers, not knowing the bolts had already been quietly removed from his own doors. Basil and his men were waiting. As Michael tried to defend himself, they cut off his hands before finishing him off. He was 27 years old, murdered in his own bedroom by the peasant he'd personally lifted onto the throne. Andronikos I spent his youth seducing princesses and fleeing across foreign courts one step ahead of scandal. When he finally seized the throne at 60, he didn't rule, he purged. Anyone who stood in his way was executed or mutilated, no exceptions. He even ordered the strangling of the 14-year-old boy emperor he had personally sworn to protect. That was the moment Constantinople's patience finally ran out. When a rival took refuge inside the Hagia Sophia, the entire city rose up at once. What happened to Andronikos next is the single most brutal death of any Byzantine ruler, and the mob made sure it lasted 3 full days before it was over. He was captured, publicly tortured for 3 days straight, his teeth pulled, his arm chopped off, boiling water poured across his face, and then, still alive, he was dragged into the hippodrome and torn apart by the crowd he had once ruled. Zeno was always the outsider, an Isaurian barbarian the Constantinople court spent 17 straight years trying to overthrow. He survived coup after coup, many of them plotted by his own mother-in-law. By 491 AD, the stress had visibly worn him down. Then, without warning, Zeno collapsed. The court moved fast, too fast. He was declared dead and sealed inside his imperial tomb before anyone thought to double-check. What actually happened to him next is one of the darkest stories in the entire empire's history. Zeno hadn't died at all. He'd suffered a massive epileptic seizure. According to the chronicles, guards heard him scratching at the tomb walls and screaming to be let out. His wife allegedly refused to open it. He was left to die of thirst or suffocation, sealed inside stone, fully conscious the entire time. Constantine XI inherited a ghost of an empire. By 1453, he had 8,000 men to defend Constantinople against an Ottoman army more than 100,000 strong. For 6 straight weeks, he watched a single massive cannon batter down walls that had stood for 1,000 years. On the night of May 28th, he took his final communion inside the Hagia Sophia and asked forgiveness from everyone he'd ever wronged in his life. He knew exactly what the next morning would bring, and he chose to face it anyway. When the walls were finally breached, Constantine had one obvious way out. He didn't take it. He tore off his imperial regalia so he'd look like an ordinary soldier and threw himself into the street fighting as his city fell around him. He died in that fight, and his body was never definitively found, which is exactly why legend says an angel turned him to marble and that he's still waiting beneath the Golden Gate to rise again. A baptism timed to the final hour. A body swollen and betrayed by itself twice over. A peaceful death that almost never happened in this job. A husband murdered by his wife's lover. A peasant who cut off the hands of the man who made him. A 3-day public dismantling in front of a screaming crowd. A man buried alive, scratching at stone.
10 men, 10 crowns. Almost none of them got to choose how it ended, because in Byzantium, the throne never really belonged to you. It just borrowed you for a while.
If this is the kind of history they never taught you in school, subscribe. A new one drops every 2 days, and the next name might surprise you even more than this one did.